Hi, dear friends. Some words of Torah for Parshat Pekudei and Parshat HaChodesh. One of the benefits of religion is that it helps one make sense out of life. Judaism provides structure and purpose to everything we do, speak, and think about. At the same time, there are so many things contained within Jewish practice that are confusing and for some, quite frankly, unfulfilling. While so much of our religious practice, such as the spiritual beauty of a Shabbos table with Zimirot and Divrei Torah, and the feelings we have after having performed an act of charity or chesed, envelops us with a feeling of divine embrace. But other mitzvot seem arcane, outdated, and ineffective in building that kind of spiritual energy. This Shabbos will finish the book of Shemot. It ends with the culmination of the entire formation of our people as Am Yisrael, the people who succeeded in bringing the divine presence into the world. The Mishkan is completed, and the final verses of the book of Exodus describe how a cloud descended, representing what's called the Kvod Hashem, the glory of God, abiding within the Jewish encampment. At the same time, the Torah makes a point of stating that as long as this divine cloud filled the Mishkan, not even Moshe was able to access this holy place because of the otherworldly, glorious divinity that filled the room. Only after the cloud lifted above the Mishkan was Moshe granted permission to enter. Now, the Talmud raises a curious contradiction. On the one hand, the Mishkan's holy cloud of glory would not allow even Moshe to enter. On the other hand, we read of the very same holy cloud hovering over Mount Sinai at the time of the giving of the Torah, which we read about in Parshat Yitro. There, the Torah states that Moshe entered the cloud. If the cloud was too holy for mortals to enter, why was Moshe given permission to enter the cloud atop Mount Sinai? The Gemara offers two answers to this question. Number one, normally the cloud would have been impenetrable to any human being. But in the case of Mount Sinai, God grabbed Moshe and pulled him unnaturally into the cloud. Answer number two, in the case of Mount Sinai, Hashem allowed a special passageway to open up in the middle of the cloud that allowed Moshe to enter. The Gemara has answered the technical question of how it was possible for Moshe to enter the cloud atop Mount Sinai, but it doesn't answer the more basic question. Why the difference? Why did God grant permission to enter the cloud atop Mount Sinai, but not when it came to welcoming the divine presence upon the Mishkan's inaugural? Furthermore, the imagery of the Midrash obviously contains something esoteric. What difference does it make whether God grabbed Moshe and pulled him into the cloud, or whether Moshe was able to walk into the cloud on his own because of a pathway? We need to read between the lines for an answer. So consider. In order for Moshe to be able to communicate the Torah effectively, he needed to have an intimate understanding of it, unblocked and unclouded by any obstacle or ambiguity. The Torah refers to his prophecy as the highest form of prophecy precisely for that reason, in that it needed to have crystal clarity that required him to transcend the cloud and encounter God, as the Torah says, peh el peh, mouth to mouth and face to face. This alone suffices to explain why Hashem made an exception at the event of Mount Sinai, allowing Moshe to enter a sanctum that would normally be too holy for mortals. But I believe that there's a deeper message through the Talmud's creation of a contrast between Mount Sinai and the Mishkan. Man is comprised of two spiritual components, his mind and his heart. Man utilizes his intellectual capacity to grasp concepts and ideas that enhance him as a human being. Knowledge, particularly of God, his creation, and his Torah, elevate the human being intellectually. Man also, however, has a heart, the traditional seat of emotion, where he worships God not through his intellect, but rather with the devotional emotions of fear and love. Both the mind and the heart necessarily must be engaged for the well-rounded Jew who wishes to serve Hashem with his entire being. But there's an important difference between the mind and the heart. Man's intellect has complete access into the cloud. That is, in order to connect with Hashem through one's mind, clarity of thought is necessary. One doesn't achieve great intellectual achievements while in a state of confusion, despair, or occluded thought. Man's mind must be allowed to see things with a razor sharpness in order to bond with God with one's mind. By contrast, worship of the heart often involves a cry to Hashem amidst confusion and darkness. It is often the very lack of understanding that compels the worshiper to seek out God and find fulfillment and redemption through that call. As the Kutzker used to say, there is nothing as whole as a broken heart. And we would add to that, there is nothing as clarified as a confused and desperate heart. The two locations, Mount Sinai and the Mishkan, represent these two forms of divine worship. One is the place of receiving the Torah, the means of intellectual elevation and bonding with Hashem through one's mind. That's Mount Sinai. The Mishkan is the place of worship through prayer and the Korbanot. It represents the devotion of the heart. Perhaps the Torah is contrasting Moshe's ability to penetrate the cloud atop Mount Sinai versus his inability to penetrate it in the Mishkan, is a way of communicating that while intellectual devotion requires absolute clarity unfettered by the cloud, emotional devotion is occluded by the cloud. It is that very blockage that causes the worshiper to emotionally cast himself at God's feet. The Talmud's two explanations as to how Moshe was able to penetrate the cloud atop Mount Sinai represent a glimpse into how man can penetrate the intellectual blockages of life. According to the first opinion, that God grabbed Moshe, intellectual clarity can only be achieved through miraculous means. Man lacks the capacity to achieve those eureka moments unless Hashem is actually pulling him along and allowing him to transcend the limited powers of the intellect. But the second opinion believes that the human intellect is a far stronger tool than we think. Even when one feels that he has hit an intellectual brick wall, it is only because he hasn't beseeched God sufficiently for a breakthrough. It is not that God has to unnaturally pull you past the cloud. It is rather that you have to sufficiently desire that breakthrough in order for it to happen. The pathway through the cloud was always available. All you have to do is want it enough, and the cloud will part a path for you. This Shabbos doesn't just mark the conclusion of the book of Exodus. It is also when we read Parshat HaChodesh, when Bnei Israel received their very first communication from Hashem, instructing them how to worship Him. It's very telling that the first mitzvot given to Bnei Israel were not mitzvot of the intellect, but rather worshipful mitzvot that required emotional devotion. As recently liberated slaves, Bnei Israel were not yet capable of mustering the intellectual caliber necessary for serving God with their minds, but they were certainly capable of worshiping with their hearts, especially amidst the very confusing and overwhelming Exodus experience. They undoubtedly felt the cloud of obscurity confusing their worship. That is precisely what the Torah wishes for us to learn. Even when the worship is bewildering and intellectually unsatisfying, the fact that Hashem asked us to worship Him in this way makes the devotional exercise meaningful. Sometimes this must not only be enough, it must be the preferred way of devoting ourselves to the Torah's mitzvot. Now, that is not to say that we should mindlessly go through the motions. If you find yourself performing mitzvot without passion, try to recapture the positive emotions. For example, when cleaning the house for Pesach, blast the music on high and dance through the cleaning. That said, even when we aren't feeling the intellectual satisfaction from a mitzvah, our devotion is still there, amidst the clouds of confusion. And so, dear friends, may our Pesach preparations and our celebrations of the holiday be ones of great joy, meaning and purpose. May this be our last Pesach in exile. L'shana haba'a b'Yerushalayim habenuya. Amen. Have a beautiful Shabbos. Shabbat Shalom.